Welcome, everyone. My name is Antje Petty. I'm with the Max Kade Institute for German American Studies at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. We're delighted that so many of you are joining us tonight for Dr. Emily Sneff's presentation, The German Audience for the U.S. Declaration of Independence. This program is a collaboration between the Max Kade Institute, the German Society of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, and the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C., with support from the Friends of the Max Kade Institute. Our moderators tonight will be Bettina Hess from the German Society of Pennsylvania and Jana Keck from the German Historical Institute. And now I will hand things over to Bettina, Jana, and Emily.
Thank you so much, Antje. Good evening, everyone from Washington, D.C. My name is Jana Keck. I'm a research fellow at the German Historical Institute, Washington. The GHI is a Center for Advanced Historical Research. From its locations in Washington, D.C., but also Berkeley, California, the Institute fosters scholarship and dialogue that connects historians across continents, disciplines, and generations. The GHI builds bridges between academic research and public discourse, including through events like tonight's, organized in collaboration with the Max Kade Institute and the German Society of Pennsylvania. And now I'm handing over to Bettina.
Okay, thanks, Jana. I'm Bettina Hess. I'm the librarian at the German Society of Pennsylvania. We are located in Philadelphia, and the German Society has been in Philadelphia since 1764 when it was founded to aid newly arrived German immigrants. The library was established in 1817 for the use of its members, but has since, in more recent times, become a research library that's used by scholars, genealogists, anyone interested in researching German and German American history. In addition to the Society's own records dating back to the founding, we hold records of other German organizations focused on Philadelphia primarily, and a lot of printed and manuscript material documenting the German experience in America. You can find, if you want more information, you can go to our website. We have an online catalog and research guide, and if you're interested in finding more, that's the place to go. I had one quick announcement I wanted to make before I introduce Emily. Emily will be talking about the German Declaration of Independence, and I just wanted to let people know that at the German Society, we have some very beautiful prints of this Declaration of Independence. And if you're interested, they're available for purchase. If you're interested, you can go to the German Society's website and click on the link for more information. They're nice for framing and could make a nice holiday gift. Now I'm happy to introduce Emily Sneff. Dr. Emily Sneff. She is an early American historian and a leading expert on the Declaration of Independence. She's the consulting curator for exhibitions planned for the Semiquincentennial, including the Declaration's Journey at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, and the exhibition entitled Window to the Revolution, Pennsylvania Germans and the War for Independence at Historic Trappe in Pennsylvania. Her book, When the Declaration of Independence Was News, is going to be published in April 2026 with the Oxford University Press. And now I'm going to hand it over to Emily.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to have this opportunity to speak with all of you this evening, and what a terrific crowd. The benefit of Zoom presentations allowing us all to be together from all over the place. I want to thank the Max Kade Institute, the German Historical Institute, and the German Society of Pennsylvania for bringing this presentation to life. And I will forewarn you that I have a nagging cough, which I am hoping will stay at bay during this presentation. But if I suddenly mute myself, hopefully you'll understand why. So to get things started, my book, as Bettina just mentioned, is called When the Declaration of Independence Was News. It will be coming out next spring. And it does what the title says. It explores the period of time when the Declaration of Independence was news, not the sort of hallowed, treasured text that we think of today, but something you would find in the columns of a newspaper. And so this period of time when the Declaration was news, for me, stretches from May 1776, when the Continental Congress first issued a text while they were meeting in Philadelphia that was perceived by some, both inside and outside of Congress, as a Declaration of Independence. And it runs through the summer and fall all the way to January 1777, when the Continental Congress asked a Baltimore printer named Mary Catherine Goddard to create the first broadsides of the Declaration with the names of the men who had signed the parchment copy by that time. So in these 9 months from May to January, the news of independence traveled widely throughout the United States, to the Caribbean and to Canada, all over Europe. And although we don't have the evidence to prove it, more than likely to Africa as well, just because of the way that ships moved around the Atlantic Ocean. I am most interested in the process of declaring independence, how the text of the Declaration traveled, how it was proclaimed in public squares, and how people reacted to it. And as we approach the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 2026, I think that focusing on all of the people involved in that process of declaring independence can help us to appreciate the founding document of the United States in new ways. When we think about the German audience for the Declaration of Independence, we're essentially looking at 2 periods of time: early July in the United States and late August into September in Europe. Remember, communication in 1776 was not instantaneous. In 1776, there were an estimated 250,000 ethnically German people living in the colonies that became the United States. That's 10% of the total settler population, which had a much higher concentration in Pennsylvania, especially in the area around Philadelphia. These were communities of first, second, and third generation Americans living through war and the formation of a new nation and a new national culture. It took a while and a failed effort by Benjamin Franklin for German print culture to get off the ground in the colonies. But by 1776, Philadelphia was pretty well established as a center for German printing. Henry Miller established the Staatsbote, or State Courier, a newspaper in Philadelphia in 1762. And in his first issue, he included a message to his readers, as was customary when publishing a new newspaper. He specifically said that his reason for this undertaking was the widespread interest in a well-organized weekly German language newspaper, especially since the Germans in this part of the world were so far removed from their homeland. And I love this first issue of Miller's newspaper because he listed out dozens of men all across the colonies who would be agents, would be able to sell subscriptions for his newspaper and deliver copies to people outside of the greater Philadelphia area. But he didn't tell any of these men ahead of time. So he said, I hope that they won't be insulted by the fact that I'm listing them here as my agents. And it just shows his intention of reaching all of the ethnically German people that he possibly could, and knowing that there was a greater concentration in Philadelphia. So that was 1762. 13 years later, in April 1775, you have the battles of Lexington and Concord. The first shots of the American Revolution are fired. And a few weeks after that, Miller switched from a weekly publication schedule every Tuesday to a bi-weekly schedule every Tuesday and Friday. And when he announced this decision, he said that the present perplexing and confused times must necessarily make every newspaper reader eager for news. That included not only English newspaper readers, but German newspaper readers as well. On July 5th, 1776, so that's the day after Independence Day, Henry Miller's Staatsbote was the first newspaper to report that the Declaration of Independence was being printed. You can see this short little 2 paragraphs where he announced that the declaration in English is now in the press, more specifically John Dunlap's press. Dunlap was an immigrant from Northern Ireland, and his printing office was at the southeast corner of Second and Market Streets, a few blocks from the Pennsylvania State House, or Independence Hall as we know it now. And Dunlap created probably a few hundred broadsides or poster-sized sheets of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th and 5th, working through the night. And these were for the Continental Congress to send out to each of the states and to the Continental Army. So you would have needed a few hundred just to fulfill those needs. You can imagine these Dunlap broadsides being held at public readings or used by other printers to create new copies of the Declaration, as we'll see. It seems safe to assume that the German translators in Philadelphia relied on Dunlap's broadside. Either that or the first newspaper printing, the Pennsylvania Evening Post, which came out on Saturday, July 6th, 1776. There was no direct engagement between the Continental Congress and the German language printers in Philadelphia, but certainly the delegates were aware that in Pennsylvania, there were a lot of people who would learn the news of independence in German. Then on July 9th, so in the next issue of the Staatsbote, we have the Declaration of Independence in full in German. This is really remarkable. 5 days after the Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, all 1,320 words of the English text were translated, typeset, and printed in another language. You can see here that the newspaper was typically set in 3 columns, but the Declaration was set in 2 columns, and it has a nice wide title on the front page. Just to give you a sense of how the text is laid out, these first 2 paragraphs in the furthest left column are the preamble of the Declaration. And this is where you find some of the phrases that have become the most popular and powerful over the last nearly 250 years. All men are created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Next, there's a list of grievances, 27 grievances against King George III. Most of the grievances in this list begin with he has, or in German, hat. It's this list of evidence of the king's tyrannical rule over the colonies that sets up the final paragraph, which is the actual Declaration of Independence. This is where the Continental Congress articulated a clear transition from united colonies to the free and independent United States of America. This final paragraph says that the United States has the right to wage war, pursue peace, conduct commerce, and secure foreign alliances. And as we'll see, it was this paragraph that people on the other side of the Atlantic paid the most attention to because it really was the Declaration of Independence. In that same issue of the Staatsbote, there was also a description of the public reading of the Declaration of Independence at Independence Hall in the courtyard of the Pennsylvania State House on July 8th, 1776. July 8th was an election day in Pennsylvania. Electors were supposed to choose who they wanted to send to a constitutional convention in Philadelphia to craft a new government for the Commonwealth. And the Pennsylvania Committee of Safety decided that since people would already be gathering at polling locations on July 8th, it made sense to schedule public readings of the Declaration for that same day. That way, electors, men, would be able to bring the news of independence home to their families, their communities. And there were readings of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, Reading, Easton, and surely other places as well that we just don't have the evidence for. We do know that Dunlap broadsides were sent out to those locations to be read aloud. We actually have the receipt that paid for the rider to carry those Dunlap broadsides out to these other locations. The report of the public reading in Philadelphia at noon on July 8th in the Staatsbote is really interesting because it has details in it that are in no other newspaper in Philadelphia or anywhere else. So I have to imagine that Henry Miller was either a direct observer of this reading, or he got a really good description from other people who had attended. And this paragraph essentially says that a crowd gathered to hear the declaration publicly proclaimed in the English language from a lofty scaffold in the State House courtyard. This was a stage that was probably built for a meeting that had taken place in May. You have to remember that at this time, you didn't have microphones. You had to use natural amplification of being above a crowd. So in most cases, when the declaration was read aloud, it was done so from the steps of a courthouse or from a person being on horseback, or in this case, on a sort of scaffolding stage. The proclamation, the declaration, was made by Colonel John Nixon. You can see his name about halfway down the paragraph, with the Sheriff of Philadelphia County, William DeWeese, at his side. In attendance were many members of the Continental Congress, the Pennsylvania Assembly, and high military officials, plus perhaps several thousand people who attended this solemn event. And after the declaration was read, 3 cheers were raised with the words, "God bless the free states of North America. Every true friend of these colonies can and will say yes and amen to this." So there's a little bit of editorializing here, right? We can clearly see that Henry Miller not only had these details, but he also had a sort of support for independence that was coming through on the page. Around the same time that the Declaration of Independence was printed in German in the Staatsbote, it was also printed as the broadside that you see here, which was created by Melchior Steiner and Charles Sist. These two printings, the newspaper and the broadside, are nearly identical translations. So there was definitely some collaboration at play. Only 2 of these broadsides are known to survive. One is in Berlin, and one is at Gettysburg College normally. It is currently on loan to the Museum of the American Revolution for their special exhibition, The Declaration's Journey, which I worked on, which will be open until January 2027. And this broadside sits in a case alongside other early printings of the Declaration, which will rotate over time, but the German translation will be there for the whole run of the exhibit, which is really exciting. Speaking of which, if anyone ever comes across one of these, please know that it's extremely important. As I said, we only have 2 surviving examples, and we're grateful to the German Society of Pennsylvania for their very high quality reproduction that allows more people to kind of engage with what that broadside would have looked like. But getting back to this actual document, here you can see how the text is organized. So it begins with the preamble in the opening paragraphs of the first column, again, organized in 2 columns, just like the newspaper was. The grievances span the 2 columns, and then the final paragraph is the declaration itself. You can see the colophon that's at the bottom below this sort of decorative line of type says that it was printed by Steiner and Sist in Philadelphia. And this advertisement appeared in the English language newspapers in Philadelphia about 7 months earlier. And it gives us a sense of what Steiner and Sist intended for their printing partnership, which was still fairly new at the time that they produced this broadside. As you can see, it says that they are offering printing in English, German, and other languages. And after the time that this advertisement was printed, they actually moved locations. So this is a sort of moment in time when they're just really setting up their shop. It seems as though within this partnership, Sist was really the translator heavyweight. And he had a fascinating life. He was born in a German enclave in St. Petersburg and educated in Halle. He fomented some rebellion in Russia, which got him exiled to Siberia. And then he escaped and immigrated to Philadelphia. where he advertised his abilities as a language tutor in German and Latin before joining up with Melchior Steiner. And I should note that Sist is not his actual surname. After fleeing Russia, he created a new surname using the initials of his full name. And I've been in conversation with one of his descendants who still uses the Sist surname, which is fascinating. I want to take a moment to think about what the creation of German broadsides of the Declaration means. So I've put Steiner and Sist's broadside alongside John Dunlap's broadside on the left here. Newspapers were things that you could read in private or leave in a local tavern for other people to pick up and read. But broadsides were meant to be used for public readings or posted up in public spaces. These are large posters. They're a dominating form of print culture. The German broadsides created in Philadelphia suggest that there were people living in the newly United States who used the German language in their everyday lives and wanted to promote the news of independence in German. We don't know for absolute certain if there were any public readings of the Declaration in German. There's some speculation that the reading that took place in Reading, Pennsylvania, might have been in German. It was done by a sheriff who was of German ethnicity. That might have been logistically a bit challenging because of when the broadsides were printed in Philadelphia. But we do know that these broadsides could have been used for public readings or even readings within a community, at a church, in a family. Henry Miller had agents all over the colonies to help distribute his newspaper. So it's possible that newspaper printings, the Staatsbote, could have traveled very far outside of Philadelphia. It's maybe unlikely because at this point in the war, mail was really unreliable. So I like to think about the fact that either Miller's Staatsbote or Steiner and Sist's broadsides could have gone out to all these different German-speaking communities across the United States. But I think it's more practical to assume that people were mostly using these copies in the greater Philadelphia area. I wish that more of the German printing survived. We do have a few more newspapers that survive than the broadside, but it's hard to piece together the details without the level of material evidence that we have for English language copies. It's also important to remember that although the German printings quickly circulated, were produced very quickly, circulated very quickly, some German-speaking people still interacted primarily with the English printings of the Declaration. And to give one example, here you can see Jonas Phillips and his wife, Rebecca. I have to give Rebecca her flowers because together they had 21 children, but also she came from a prominent Sephardic Jewish family, while Jonas Phillips had come from Hesse to the colonies as an indentured laborer. So it was really Rebecca's clout and connections that allowed Jonas Phillips to become a very successful merchant. They married in New York and then moved to Philadelphia, where they became part of the active and growing Jewish community and congregation Mikveh Israel. And Jonas Phillips started a store on Market Street. Here you can see an advertisement for his store on the back page of the same issue of the Staatsbote as the Declaration of Independence. And so we can see that in July 1776, he had fine French indigo, the best writing paper, linens, checked and striped fabrics, needles and pins, umbrellas, wines, and other sundries for sale. In late July 1776, Jonas Phillips wrote out this list of products that he would like to sell in his store. And he sent it to Samuel Curson, who was a mercantile agent on the Dutch Caribbean island of St. Eustatius. The list includes, in English, linens, blankets, woolen goods for winter, ivory combs, needles, pins, and medicines. And so between the printed advertisement and the handwritten list from the same month of the year, we get the sense that Phillips kept a pretty diverse inventory in his store. We can almost recreate what he was selling and what people were interested in buying. But what is most interesting about this list is actually what is on the back. On the back of the list of things that Jonas Phillips wanted to sell in his Philadelphia store, he wrote a letter dated July 28, 1776, to another merchant, a member of his family, Gumpel Sampson, who was living in Amsterdam. Now, you might have a little bit of trouble reading this letter, so let me zoom in on a particular passage. Yeah, that probably doesn't make it any better. That's because Jonas Phillips wrote this letter not in English, not in German, but in Yiddish, or a sort of Proto-Yiddish and Judeo-German script. I first saw this letter 8 years ago in the National Archives at Kew outside London. You're probably thinking what I was thinking back then, which is, how did this letter end up in the British archives? Well, Jonas Phillips sent it to Amsterdam via St. Eustatius in the Caribbean. And sometime after it left Phillips's contact on St. Eustatius, the letter was intercepted by a British ship. If you can imagine being a British officer in 1776, patrolling the Caribbean, and you see this letter written from Philadelphia, you might think that it was in code. You might think that it contained secret information, especially since Jonas Phillips enclosed a copy of the Declaration of Independence, more specifically one of John Dunlap's broadsides, for Gumpel Sampson to read. Jonas Phillips's letter fascinates me because it's not actually about the Declaration of Independence. And that's an important reminder of this period of time when the Declaration was news. It was news among other things that were news. So Phillips wanted to share, this latest information with his fellow merchant and kinsman in Amsterdam. But his letter is actually more about family and business than it is about independence. He began his letter with a blessing for Gumpel Sampson, and he signed it as Jonas, son of Phoebus of Busick. Phillips's father, Phoebus, was deceased, but his mother was still living in Europe, maybe still in Busick. And he wanted to send her some money. So he actually enclosed a bill of exchange for 10 pounds for his mother. And then Phillips described the Declaration of Independence as a declaration of the whole country, the United States. And he actually compared it to where Gumpel Sampson was living in the Dutch Republic, this idea of a confederation, trying to create some sort of context for what the Declaration of Independence wanted to accomplish. Phillips did not know what would come of the United States, but he says that he's grateful that despite the war, his Philadelphia business was doing well. And he closed his letter with greetings and blessings from his wife, Rebecca, and their children. At one point in this letter, when he was describing the financial stakes of the war and that it had not impacted his business thus far, he actually says that he could explain himself better in English. So to me, this suggests that he wrote this letter in Yiddish intentionally to protect its contents, not because they were secret, but because they were personal. And transatlantic communication during the war was extremely unreliable. Phillips knew that as a merchant who was regularly doing business with folks on the other side of the Atlantic. So he anticipated that his message back to Europe could be intercepted, and ultimately he was right. Jonas Phillips's Dunlap broadside, along with the enclosing letter and the 10 pounds for his mother and his portrait, are all on display at the Museum of the American Revolution for the Declaration's journey. These documents are actually returning to Philadelphia for the first time since 1776, which creates this really fascinating full circle moment. And I'm so pleased to see them on view in the exhibit. And also they are right across the space from Steiner and Siss's broadside of the Declaration of Independence. So really some German highlights are right up front in the exhibit. Definitely recommend checking it out. One other connection between the Phillips family and the Declaration: Jonas and Rebecca Phillips's daughter, Rachel, who you can see here in this gorgeous portrait, is actually buried at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello plantation. Rachel's son was Uriah Phillips Levy, who had a pretty contentious career in the US Navy, but he did become the first Jewish American Commodore in the Navy. And he purchased Jefferson's home to save it from falling apart after Jefferson's death. And this was in part because of Levy's regard for Jefferson as the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. So Rachel Phillips Levy moved into Monticello, spent the end of her life there, and is buried on the property. We've already seen some of the perils of transatlantic correspondence. So now let's turn to how the Declaration of Independence got to Europe. And it's not quite as straightforward as you might think. Essentially, copies of the Declaration traveled from Philadelphia to New York onto British mail ships, because there was a massive British fleet portending the arrival of the German mercenary soldiers who would be arriving soon. And so it went on to British mail ships, traveled across the Atlantic to London, and then the Declaration was copied into British newspapers, which then crossed the English Channel, and the news was translated into European newspapers. So this means that British printers in London, actually had much more control over how Europe received the news of independence than the Continental Congress did. Definitely was not their intention. I think they would have preferred to have much more power over how the powers of the earth, the European states, were receiving the news of the Declaration of Independence. But this is how communication worked at this particular moment in the war. With our remaining time, I wanted to take a sampling of different German newspaper printings of the Declaration in Europe, so that you get a sense of how the text was presented to European news readers. I should note that this work would have been impossible to do even 10 years ago. I was doing a lot of this research in 2020 to 2021 at a time when international research was just not possible. And so I started digging into European newspaper databases of digitized newspapers. And this allows the sort of going through copy by copy to track down the news of independence very quickly. Even in languages that I'm not familiar with, I can always kind of identify John Hancock's name. It might be Jean Hancock or Giovanni Hancock, but it's very easy to identify his name. So without the digitization of European newspapers, alongside the digitization of US newspapers, this kind of research would be almost impossible. So I definitely don't have a full survey of every German language newspaper printing of the Declaration, but I have enough to get a sense of how different communities were learning about the news. So to start, here's an example of a newspaper in Hamburg. And you can see that the Declaration is part of the news under the heading London, dated August 16th. So August 16th was the date that the Declaration of Independence was first published in London newspapers. And at this time, the United States did not have their own heading in European newspapers. All the news was organized geographically. So it would be under the headings, St. Petersburg, Madrid, Rome, London. There was no Philadelphia heading as of yet. So if you're looking for the Declaration of Independence in Europe, you actually have to look under the London heading. So there's a few paragraphs of news, and then the Declaration starts with when in the course of human events. And this is a full printing of the Declaration of Independence, with the exception that the word tyrant has been censored. It says T and then has a dash after it. And this happened in about half of the newspaper printings in London. So this is probably a censored word that was picked up by the European translators rather than their own decision to censor the word tyrant. So here we have the full text of the Declaration of Independence printed in Hamburg on August 24th, 1776. Here we have the full text almost split up between two different issues. So first, in the August 27th issue of this newspaper, you have the first few paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence. And then at the bottom of that first page, it says to be continued. Then in the following issue, 2 days later on August 29th, the text picks up and continues. And at the end of this page, it says, followed by the conclusion. Now, I have looked through this newspaper and I cannot find the conclusion of the declaration in any issue. I can't figure out if it was printed before August 27th or after August 29th. I just have not been able to find it. So assuming that it was never printed, there may have been some disappointed readers trying to finish this long document, 1,300 words, and never getting that concluding paragraph. Now, if we go over to Altoona, there's a couple of newspapers there. And here we get a sense of how the declaration was actually excerpted. So not printed in full, but only printed in part. And you can see in that second column, there's a parenthetical note to the readers. And a rough translation of that says that after a lengthy account of the repeated complaints that the Continental Congress had fruitlessly brought before the king, the parliament, and the nation, they end the declaration with these words. So essentially, skipping over the entire list of grievances and just getting to that final paragraph, the conclusion, the Declaration of Independence itself. This is something that London printers did. They skipped over the list of grievances, in some cases to save space, to cut out the longest part of the declaration, kept the text to a more kind of manageable amount. But in some cases, it was to avoid potential charges of sedition for printing all of these terrible things that the king had done according to the Continental Congress. So again, this is probably a decision made by the printer in Altoona based on the London newspaper that they were looking at, but it could have also been based on their own decision to save some space in the pages of their newspaper. Here's another printing in Altoona. And in here, the text is actually like really, really tightly condensed to try to fit it all in under the London heading. You can see how the text really compresses by comparison to the previous paragraph of news from Paris. And here again, the list of grievances is skipped over. And this was not one Altoona newspaper copying from the other, because that parenthetical note explaining the decision to skip the list of grievances is slightly different. And it's a little bit more opinionated about what the grievances were doing. It describes the series of complaints which the colonies brought against the current government, some of which are already known. And this was something that appeared frequently in London newspapers, that the list of grievances was just articulating what the Continental Congress had put into their previous petitions. But they do admit it was too extensive to be listed here. So again, an excerpt of just the opening and closing paragraphs of the declaration. That's all you're getting in Altoona. If we go over to Vienna at the very end of August, we can see the declaration is printed in this newspaper. And similarly, the text is excerpted. And oops, sorry. There's sort of an explanation that a sort of introduction and then an explanation that the grievances are skipped over, and then the concluding paragraphs. And you can see the down by the word Verton, it begins the final paragraph. So really, when the text was excerpted, the focus was kept on that final paragraph of the declaration. Here's an example of getting even less of the declaration in the pages of your weekly Intelligencer. Here, only the last paragraph of the declaration is included. Still, John Hancock's name is here, but the focus is exclusively on that final paragraph of the declaration. And this was printed on the same day as that Vienna newspaper. And here's another example of another newspaper in Hamburg, which honestly I just included because of this gorgeous masthead with this courier, this man on horseback. But here again, you can see the quotation marks being used to show that this is an excerpt from the text. And then one final example, and this is from Mannheim. And this paragraph has no quotation marks in it. It is actually a mix of the actual text from the Declaration of Independence and pieces of fake news that had entered the conversation in London. And it's all sort of mashed together in a single paragraph that makes it very difficult to tell what was in the Declaration of Independence itself. In London, this story circulates that the Declaration of Independence was a declaration of war, and that having drawn the sword in defense of all that was dear to them, the colonies were not necessarily going to sheath it again. So that piece about that sword combines with this information about a declaration of war, which the Declaration of Independence was not, because it came 15 months after the first shots of the war were fired at Lexington and Concord. And that combines here with the last sentence of the Declaration of Independence. So really, my point in showing this is just to see, depending on where you were, you could read the entire full text of the Declaration of Independence, or you could get something like this, where your understanding of the independence of the United States was completely curated by London newspaper printers without your knowledge. So there's this really wide range of experiences, very different than what the German reading public in the United States was getting with the printings that came out of Philadelphia. I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about translation. And I will say off the bat, despite my last name, I have very little German knowledge. I actually have about 9 different languages in my book. I have half a chapter on Portuguese. I have quite a bit of French. So I got to the point where I thought, why bother learning any particular language? I can get by with just being able to identify the Declaration. I hope to rectify at least my German knowledge over time. I'm getting a little bit better, in part because I work for Historic Trappe, which is the homes of the Muhlenberg family outside of Philadelphia. But just a little bit about translation. Let's look at this sentence. To prove this, let facts be presented to a candid world. This is the final sentence of the preamble before the list of grievances. So essentially in this sentence, the facts are the 27 grievances that follow. In the United States, in Philadelphia, the German translation is facta. And I read this as a sort of legal Latin understanding of the word. And that's really how Thomas Jefferson intended it when he drafted this list of grievances, that the grievances build up over time, so that you really get a sense that independence is necessary. It's supposed to be a sort of legal case of building evidence. So facta feels like an accurate sort of translation of that. But when the Declaration was printed in Altoona, in the Reichsbestruder, facts was translated as Befehle. And then in another newspaper, it was translated as Begebenheiten. And both of these translations imply events or incidents. And you could certainly read the grievances that way, that it's all of these different things that had happened to people across the colonies. But that's a very different understanding of how the Declaration of Independence functions as a text. And if you think about those newspapers that skip over the list of grievances, if it's just a list of events or incidents, it's not quite as important to the text as if it's a list of evidence that is making the argument for why independence is absolutely necessary. So with this one word, we see 2 completely different understandings of how the Declaration of Independence functioned and how the logical conclusion that the king could no longer be the ruler of the colonists came about, with Jefferson's initial drafting, with the Continental Congress's approval. That gets lost as the Declaration crosses the English Channel. To give another example, let's look at the final phrase of the Declaration, and that's the delegates' commitment of our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. look here at how different the translations were in Philadelphia and in Munster. Why? Well, we're missing a few pieces of the puzzle here. So tracing the way that news operated, that it went from Philadelphia to New York to London and then across the English Channel, we can see that we're starting with an English, text in Philadelphia. It's reprinted in English in London, and then it's translated into French in Leiden, in the Leiden Gazette, which was a French language newspaper in the Dutch Republic. It was one of the most widely circulated newspapers in Europe, and a number of other printers, including some German printers, relied on the Leiden Gazette for their printings. So you can see here that the phrase is sort of truncated in the French version, and then in Munster, it's further sort of taken out of that initial context. So you can see just the difference between the German translation that was happening in Europe and the German translation that was happening in Philadelphia, where Steiner, Sist, Miller, they had this vocabulary of revolution and independence. They had been printing things like Common Sense and other resolutions of the Continental Congress. They had a clear sense of how to translate the Declaration so that German reading people got the same experience as their English reading neighbors. Really important point. So what are our takeaways about the German audience for the Declaration of Independence? Well, first and foremost, I hope you've gotten the sense that the Declaration was a multilingual document from the beginning. For every German newspaper printing in Europe that I've shown you today, I could have shown you Dutch, Danish, Swedish, French, Italian, Polish. There's so many different European gazettes that are translating in the same way, whether it's the full text, excerpted text, condensed and summarized text, a little bit of fake news from London. This is happening all over the place. So even though the Continental Congress issued the Declaration of Independence in English, it was immediately translated for people within the United States, for German people, and then very soon after that for Native Americans, translated into French and then further translated into indigenous languages. And then as it crosses the Atlantic into Europe, it's translated again. French was the language of diplomacy at this time. It would have been very smart for the Continental Congress to have their own authorized French translation of the Declaration that they could send to Europe. That didn't happen. But after Ben Franklin arrives in France in late 1776, he pays much more close attention to translating the words of the Continental Congress and having some authority over that multilinguality of Congress's work. So the Declaration was multilingual from July 1776. And when we think about the 250th and we think about the way that the United States looks today, I think that's a really important reminder that we all can engage with the Declaration in the language that is most comfortable to us. And that's actually very authentic to what people were doing in 1776. Number two, the translations in the United States did not influence the translations in Europe. It'd be very easy to assume that someone like Jonas Phillips could have packed up a broadside, one of the Steiner and Sist broadsides or the Staatsbote, and sent it over to Europe, and that was the source for European printings of the Declaration in German. That's just not how communication worked at this particular moment, in part because the war had fractured communication networks so much. So British mail was actually much more reliable at this particular moment. And that's why the Declaration crossed the Atlantic on British mail ships. So when we look at the translations that were created in Philadelphia, we have to treat them as completely separate from the translations that were created in Europe. And I think as you dig into the language, you really see that they are completely separate. They were created in totally different contexts with different vocabularies. Honestly, those European Gazette printers were just kind of treating the Declaration as another paragraph of news. They weren't spending as much time thinking about the language of independence as the men in Philadelphia were. And then finally, printers had power over how the news of independence was presented. I mentioned at the beginning that I like to focus on the people involved in the process of declaring independence. And that includes these printers that were working in Philadelphia, not in English, that were, in part of this sort of bilingual, multilingual space. There's another printer who I've failed to mention so far, Christopher Sauer, who was working in Germantown, and he did have a newspaper, but it's unclear whether that newspaper was active in the summer of 1776. I haven't been able to find any issues or any references to the printing of the Declaration in his newspaper. He was not in favor of independence. And although the Declaration of Independence was printed in every active newspaper in the United States, he might have actually questioned whether to print it or not. So if Sauer's newspaper was active that summer, that would be a fascinating story. I just don't have the evidence to connect those dots. But all the other printers that printed the Declaration of Independence, they put their stamp on it in one way or another, whether it was through their formatting, putting it in 2 columns or 3 columns, how they used indentations, how they used capitalized letters, and then how they translated the text. And so we have to give credit not only to the men who were in Independence Hall actually debating and signing the Declaration of Independence, and not just to John Dunlap, whose broadsides are valued in the multi-millions of dollars for being the first printings, but we really need to pay attention to all of these people involved in the process. And of course, the name that is on a given newspaper or broadside, that is not the only person involved in the printing process. Printing workshops, especially in the United States, you would see women, wives, daughters, sisters, in some cases, enslaved laborers, apprentices. So there's a lot of people for whom we don't have their information, but we can see the impact that they made on the Declaration of Independence. Just a final note, if you find this interesting, I would welcome you to read or subscribe to Declaration Stories. This is a weekly newsletter where every week you get a different story behind a particular copy of the Declaration of Independence. This coming week's story will be about one of these German European newspaper printings. So you may get a few more details than what you learned this evening. But this will continue through July 2026. Sorry, I'm always thinking in 1776. And starting January 1st, I'll also be launching a daily newsletter with a particular piece of news from that day in 1776 in Philadelphia. So if you're curious about what Henry Miller, Melchior Steiner, and Charles Sist were living through in Philadelphia in 1776, you might want to subscribe to News from 1776 as well. I've put my website up here. If you are interested in my forthcoming book or any of the events that will be coming up for that, feel free to reach out. I've also included my email in case we don't get to all of the questions this evening. And just to note that this is the first of 2 presentations. The next one will be focused on the German people involved in the founding of the United States. So we'll touch on these German printers again, but then spend much more time on people like Frederick Muhlenberg, the first Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. So I hope that you will join us for that next presentation in the new year. And with that, I will hand things over to the Q&A.
Thank you again for this presentation. I guess we really learned a lot. And I just want to shout out to everyone. You still have time to put in your answer in the Q&A if you want to. I'm very curious to see the exhibition. I think it's fascinating that the documents actually are going home, so to speak, for the first time, returning to Philadelphia. And also because I myself work on digitized newspapers and like the new questions we can ask by bringing together different newspapers from like different states or even countries offers like new ways to read them. So we have a lot of questions. They really touch upon like different topics from war, methodology, but also to the German language. And I will start just like with the first question that I guess goes more into the direction of what kinds of Germans did we have in the area and how did they react to the Revolutionary War, specifically also on the question of religion. And the question is, how did Mennonites and Quakers react to the Revolutionary War?
It's a great question, and an important one, because we tend to think about this sort of binary of loyalists and patriots. But there were a lot of people that, especially for religious reasons, fell somewhere in between those two extremes. And Mennonites and Quakers and other, pietist German groups certainly questioned which side to kind of ally with, and that decision of whether or not to support independence could change over the course of the war, depending on how close the war got to your own backyard. So to focus specifically on the Mennonites and other groups like that, I'm thinking especially in the greater Philadelphia area, one sort of sticking point for people was oaths of allegiance. So refusing to sign an oath of allegiance to the United States could put you in some hot water. And a number of Mennonites, as well as Lutherans and other folks, experienced that firsthand. I'm descended from some of the Funkites. So Christian Funk was leader of a sort of schism where one side was in favor of supporting the fight for independence and the other side was not. So definitely a spectrum of support.
I will go down the list and ask the next question from the same person. David Ortman wants to know, how did Germans living in the colonies react to German Hessian soldiers fighting for the British?
Yeah, I would recommend Frederica Bayer's book on the Hessians, but just a little bit. There was a concerted effort by the Continental Congress to encourage German people in the United States to kind of persuade the Hessians and other mercenaries to maybe change sides and stay. So we see a lot of sort of printed notices about that. I think there were mixed feelings. Some people who were frustrated at the situation that these men were being put into as mercenaries, and others who felt as though they were kind of on the wrong side of the war. So definitely mixed reactions.
Then let's move on to the next question that goes a little bit more into the direction also of language and what was the contact between, let's say, Americans and Germans in the US. So the question is, did Benjamin Franklin, but also Jefferson and Washington, did they speak German? And one particular question about Jefferson, is it true that Jefferson wrote the Declaration while lodging in a house in Philadelphia owned by a German family? This house was demolished, I'm told, in the late 1800s.
To answer the second part first, yes. Jefferson lodged in the Graff family's home on the corner of 7th and Market Streets. That structure was sort of rebuilt in approximation before the bicentennial. So there is a Declaration House on that site. That was actually the location of a really stunning visual installation over the past year, where the eyes of different descendants of enslaved laborers from Monticello were actually projected in the windows of that house to really emphasize the challenges of Jefferson as the author of the Declaration, but also an enslaver. So yes, that house was owned by a German family, and Jefferson did not speak German. He did, and other people in the Continental Congress, including Charles Thompson, the Secretary of Congress, know French, but didn't use it in this particular moment. Benjamin Franklin tried to launch a German newspaper, he did not have the right type to do so, and he did not have the language knowledge to do so. So that venture failed pretty quickly. But none of the sort of prototypical founding fathers knew German. One exception would be someone like Frederick Muhlenberg, who grew up in a German family, was educated in Halle, and then ultimately rose to the highest ranks of the politics in the early republic. But no German speakers in that group.
I'm just going to mention somebody has a hand raised, and I don't think we're able to take people's questions verbally. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. One question here is what size were the broadsides? And I also have to add on to that, do we know like what the print run would have been or how many of them would have been in circulation?
Yeah, both are good questions. So in the case of the German broadside, it is actually pretty comparable to John Dunlap's broadside. So I think about 20 inches wide and 30 inches tall, or something along those lines. So definitely, poster sized pieces. And as you had mentioned, Bettina, the German Society has reproductions that are, accurate to the size. In terms of the print run, and I should say other broadsides were different sizes, larger in the case of broadsides created in Massachusetts, skinnier in the case of broadsides created in New York. So it just happens that the Steiner-Insys broadside is comparable to John Dunlap's in size. In terms of the print run, we really don't know. I wish that there was more evidence for us to go on. This would have been a lot of work to only print a handful of broadsides. So you have to assume that they printed enough that could be sold or distributed or kind of make up for the work that was put into it. But we really don't know. I would guess fewer than what John Dunlap printed, but it's really hard to estimate.
There are two questions that I think are very good go together. So first of all, we're assuming that you use keyword search to search the digitized newspapers in Europe, kind of like what kind of wording were you using or what kind of words were you using. And that also goes, I would say, with this question, amazing presentation. I look forward to reading your book. Great points about translation, which led me to wonder whether you had thought about declaration as Erklärung, whose primary meaning is explanation and doesn't imply elocution and performance in quite the same way that the English word does.
That is a great point. I had not thought about Erklärung in that sense. I just kind of thought about it in the title. So I will take that under consideration because I think that does fit in with the points I was making about translation. I actually did not use search, keyword searches for the European newspapers. I went issue by issue in the date range where I thought that I'd be able to find the declaration. And this isn't just for Germany, this is the German printings, but this is for all of the different digitized sort of databases. In some cases, I looked for a very long time and never found the declaration referenced at all. But yeah, I found that even using the characters that you would expect for a native German database, I was just not coming across the declaration. So I really had to go issue by issue. The one kind of workaround for that can be Hancock. But his name is mentioned in a lot of different proceedings of the Continental Congress, and also some sort of stories about him that originate in London. For example, the week after the Declaration of Independence, the story circulates that John Hancock is in despair because he didn't actually support independence and he regrets everything. So that's not factual, but if you search for Hancock's name, you might come across that. So I opted to just go issue by issue rather than relying on keyword search. I do use keyword search for U.S. newspapers more frequently, but the OCR is never completely reliable. So if you're looking for something in particular, you do kind of have to do that digging, going issue by issue.
Thank you. Okay. I see another question here that looks interesting. How did the German immigrants in Philadelphia and elsewhere who disagreed with the conclusions of the Declaration express their disagreement in any public venues or publications, or was this too risky and suppressed?
Well, that's a great question. I wish that we had more sort of evidence. I have a lot of English-speaking folks who in diaries or letters expressed their frustration with the Declaration of Independence. My favorite is a teenager on Nantucket, a teenage girl who wrote in her diary that the Declaration was horrible and she wished that the Continental Congress had been hung 50 feet in the air before they had been allowed to issue it. So there's definitely that perspective out there. I haven't seen it so much in German. I think one particular source that I know well is Henry Muhlenberg's diaries written in German at the Lutheran Archive Center in Philadelphia, and they'll be on view at Historic Trappe next year. He expresses some sort of concern about the Declaration of Independence. He essentially says, he puts it to God, as any good Lutheran pastor would. He puts it to God to decide who will be on the right side. And he says, you'll only know the song when it's finished playing, something along those lines. So definitely there were people who were part of these German communities who would have had conversations with one another to express their frustration or disapproval of the Declaration of Independence. But we don't quite have those sources, to my knowledge, to kind of flesh out those stories more than that.
And then we have some very also, I guess, interesting suggestions. We will talk about this, I guess, in the future. And there's the question if there will be a signing of your book at the German Society of Pennsylvania. That just means we need to organize another event, but we're probably excited about this. And then I have also a question here by Walter Kamphöfner, who has also widely published on German American history. And he's asking, does Ken Burns have your email? I was rather miffed that he didn't mention this, especially because he stresses the diversity of the American colonies.
Yeah, no. And actually, because I've had events every night this week, I have yet to watch the American Revolution. So I plead the fifth. I can't say anything good or bad about it. But yeah, I think over the next year, seek out the opportunities to learn more about that diversity with the sources, not just in the sort of documentary spaces, but really thinking about the objects that survive, the diaries, the specific personal stories. That helps to really make that diversity come to life.
Here's another one that is interesting. In 1776 and 77 in Europe, how many people could read?
Off the top of my head, I don't have the statistics on that. I think one thing that's true both in Europe and in the United States is illiteracy was not necessarily a complete roadblock to learning the information that was printed in newspapers. That information could be communicated through word of mouth, could be read aloud, could be overheard. So servants might overhear discussion of news. So I don't know offhand what the literacy rates were in different places. I know that there's higher concentrations of newspapers in specific places where there was a higher literacy rate because there was a big mercantile community or universities or religious sort of centers of power. So for example, in the Dutch Republic, which is very small by comparison to the rest of Europe, we have this high concentration of newspapers. And I think that gives you a sense that there were enough people in that area who not only could read, but could subscribe, could afford to pay for a subscription to a newspaper to keep up to date on everything that was happening around the world. Newspapers would also include, essays, poems, song lyrics. So there are opportunities for sort of weekly education, which could help people who maybe had limited formal education, but could increase their sort of reading capacity through that weekly gazette.
I mean, there's so many more questions, but we're running out of time. But we're gonna save the chat and forward that to Emily, definitely. And then if you have more questions, I guess you can reach out. There are also some very interesting suggestions in the audience that say we have readings of the Declaration already in other parts of Pennsylvania, or then later, of course, in the 19th century in in Texas, for instance. I guess I just want to maybe like one last question, and then we're gonna round up this. It's like, how close were Washington and von Steuben?
I can't answer that one. I stick to the Declaration. So I'll pass that on to someone, maybe Ken Burns, to someone with a little bit more knowledge of that. But I will say that I think it's easy to assume that there are sort of these token figures in the German American community, or people who come from Germany to aid from the German states to aid the United States. And I find it much more interesting to go beyond those kind of known names to find other folks. Just as a very quick example, there's a woman named Margaret Moser who lived most of her very, very long life in Trappe, near the Muhlenberg family. She was actually, her sister was the Muhlenberg's maid for a time. Margaret Moser was a Revolutionary War widow who applied for a pension near the age of 100. So she lived an incredibly long life that really shortens that distance to the people who were alive. She would have been like 30 years old in 1776, lived to the age of 104. So there's a woman who, there's no books about her. She's not widely known. She was treated as old Auntie Moser in this area. But she has just must have had a fascinating life to live for that long, to experience the revolution in the early United States and then die in the mid-19th century. So I can't speak about von Steuben and Washington's relationship, but I do know folks like that and the German printers. I did see someone in the chat ask, if I don't know German, why did I study German printers? That's a very good existential question, which I can only say this is a small portion of my research, made more important by the German translations in the US. But I've looked at French and Danish and Dutch and all these other languages as well. So definitely a lot of stories behind the Declaration out there.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in. Thank you so much, Emily, for this really fascinating, very interesting, and very timely talk. I also look forward to your book and just learn more about everything revolution related and the different people involved in the next couple of weeks or months. And I hope to get to see the exhibit in Philadelphia. Yeah, thank you. Thank you also, Bettina and Jana and your institutes for contributing. And I also want to mention that you will hold a second talk in February, and I will send out notifications about that and sign up information. So if you're interested, go to the Max Kade website already. It's listed there, and this will focus more on the individuals that participate, the German-speaking individuals that participated in the revolution or were in the orbit at the time. Is that correct?
Yes, maybe von Steuben will get in for that one.
Then we'll get in that one. Okay. So at this point, yeah, thank you so very much. I wish you all a nice evening and hope to see you at one of our other events. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily.
Bye.
Good night.